Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Honorable Undersecretary General, Mr. Moratinos, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, esteemed members of the Academy, our remarkable host, wonderful Ambassador Bogai. It is a special honor to speak within this institution, this home of science and wisdom. Being here in the Academy of Science, I'm reminded that history itself is a science of patterns, and it moves in patterns, in cycles of rise, crisis, and renewal. History, in its cycles, reminded us that progress is never permanent, but it must be re-earned by each generation. The cycles of history do not spare even our highest institutions. United Nations too belong to such a pattern, a living experiment in humanity's capacity to learn from its own history, born from the ruins of one world, now searching for renewal in another one. The founding of United Nations was a civilizational moment. 80 years ago, in the aftermath of global catastrophe, humanity did something extraordinary. It imagined itself as one. Today, at 80 years, we stand again at a turning point in world history, turning point both geopolitical and civilizational. The question is not only whether the UN is effective, but whether our global civilization still believes in the very idea of shared dignity and destiny. In that spirit, I would like to approach the 80th anniversary of the United Nations as a civilizational reflection. Although this panel looks to the future, I will not attempt prediction because, to be honest, in today's world, this is something hard. Instead, I wish to offer a few reflections drawn from history and from thinkers who saw civilization itself as a living, cyclical process that still had much to teach us about the way ahead. And because we're gathered here in this Academy of Science and Learning, allow me to draw upon the insights of three great scholars who devoted their lives to understanding the cyclical patterns of history and civilizations: Oswald Spengler, Arnold Toynbee, and Peter M. Sorokin. Each of them believed that societies, like living organisms, pass through cycles of growth, crisis, and renewal. And I believe that today the United Nations, and indeed the entire multilateral order, is itself passing through such a civilizational cycle. A moment of both fatigue and awakening, or we might say a moment of endings and new beginnings. Spengler saw history as a sequence of organic cycles, each culture blossoming with creative energy, then declining into bureaucratic formality. In that sense, one could say that UN reflects the late phase of post-war liberal order. Institutions grow older, but ideas grow tired. Spengler warned us of the danger of institutional fatigue. He wrote that civilizations perish when their creative soul hardens into intellect. Perhaps the UN challenge today is not a moral failure, but a creative exhaustion, the tendency to repeat old forms in a new world. But this decline is not destiny. It becomes an invitation to revitalize the UN with new cultural and civilizational energies, from the global south, from youth, from women to digital citizens. The UN can avoid Spengler's so-called twilight by becoming a pluralist dawn, no longer the institutions of single civilization, but a meeting point of all. On the other hand, Sorokin's vision shows the way from materialism to moral integration. He describes civilization as oscillation between the material and spiritual cultures. The post-1945 order has been largely materialistic, focused on development, growth, and technology. But humanity now faces a moral exhaustion that materialistic progress cannot resolve. We see this in climate anxiety, digital disorientation, and social fragmentation. For Sorokin, such exhaustion marks not an end but a threshold. Civilizations, he wrote, and I quote, move through crisis, catharsis, and resurrection. Crisis exposes the hollowness of our idols. Catharsis purifies through suffering. Resurrection restored the primacy of spirit over structure. Perhaps the UN now stands at that. Its crisis is not only institutional, but civilizational. On the other hand, its catharsis will come only through self-recognition, through the pain of realizing how far it has drifted from its own founding soul. Its resurrection would mean more than reform. It would mean remembering what it was meant to embody, not arithmetic of power, but the metaphysics of peace. Sorokin would say it's time for a swing back toward meaning, ethics, and solidarity. The UN can guide that swing from technocracy to humanity, or if you want, from statistic to values. But only if it rediscovers the moral imagination, if it finds its moral will to challenge power and to speak uncomfortable truths that are not rooted in political correctness only. And Arol Toynbee is someone who called us to create a creative response to the challenges. He taught that civilization's decline is not because of enemies, but because they fail to respond creatively to challenges. The UN's vitality will not depend on whether it cannot respond to imagination of new challenges, AI government, climate migration, planetary ethics. For Toynbee, renewal comes from creative minorities, visionaries who inspire moral and institutional rebirth. The UN's creative minority today are not found only in New York and Geneva. It is in classrooms all over the world, research centers, NGOs. It is in moral imagination of youth all over the world. In the peripheries of the old world, but however, a new world, it's emerging. Dear friends, multilateralism must no longer be negotiation among powerful. There is something more important, and that is collaboration among the willing. For we no longer live in strictly Westphalian world, where sovereignty was sealed behind borders and diplomacy was the privilege of the state. We inhabit a post-Westphalian age defined by interdependence, digital proximity, and planetary fragility, where power is shared, and in this world, authority is diffused and challenges are profoundly transnational. And I believe in such a world, the spirit of international cooperation must be anchored in two old, yet timeless virtues: cosmopolitanism and stoicism. Cosmopolitanism because humanity must now learn to think and act as a single species, aware that no nation can flourish alone in a failing planet. It is in the ethic of belonging beyond borders to recognize that diversity is not a threat to identity, but its fulfillment. The UN must become the custodian of that cosmopolitan imagination, the institutional form of shared humanity. And why stoicism? Because this new era demands inner strength as much as outward reform. The capacity to remain calm amid uncertainty, to act with integrity amid complexity, and to persist even when progress fell slow. Stoicism teaches us, while we cannot control the storms of history, we can control the moral compass with which we navigate them. In the post-Westphalian world, cosmopolitan empathy must meet stoic endurance. That synthesis open to the world, yet anchored in principle in what the United Nations must embody if it is to lead humanity through the next cycle of civilizational journey. And this is something that I can see in the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the leadership of Mr. Miguel Moratinos. For 80 years, we looked to the United Nations as a reference point for diplomacy, for negotiations, for the careful balance of interests among nations. But perhaps 80 years on, we should look at it something even more essential, as a reference point of conscience. But the UN itself must be examined by conscience. We cannot ignore how it is structured, a veto system that allows power to block justice, catastrophic failure to prevent genocide, a sprawling bureaucracy that slows actions, and a funding model that rewards influence over need. All too often betray its mission. And yet, the world the UN was built to serve has changed profoundly. The unipolar moment is over, the era of hegemony is receding. Even scholars now are speaking about G0 world, one where no single power can dictate the terms of order. The West is no longer alone in shaping the global agenda. Its power may not disappear, but they will have to learn how to share with the others. At the same time, the democratic ideal itself, it is in a retreat. Around the world we see not only advance of liberty, but a democratic recession. We see democracies turning into oligarchies, and we see a world where authoritarianism finds new forms. This is not only a multipolar world, it is a multi-complex one, where influence is disappeared across states, corporations, technology, and networks, where power is much about data as about territory, and as much about legitimacy about force. Distinguished guests, dear friends, UN 2.0 could emerge on that governed digital place, planetary sustainability, and intergenerational justice, only if it brings peace. The UN was born from ruins, its renewal must come from reflection. The lesson of the cyclical theories is not fatalism, but a faith in renewal. Civilizations, like the UN, disappear only when they cease to imagine themselves differently. The 80th anniversary is not a commemoration of the past, but a call to reimagine the world we want to live together, with love, compassion, respect, peace, and human dignity. Thank you very much.